Gasper is managing editor of Catholic Family News, and we're at our annual CFN conference here in Deerfield, Illinois. And I'm here with my good friend and colleague Christopher Ferrara, who's going to be addressing the conference. Chris, remind me, what is your conference title again?
It's going to be the relationship of Maritain, Pope Montini, and Sololinsky to the liturgical crisis in its context. A lot of the speakers have already covered the details of the liturgical debacle. So I'm going to try to situate that into the context of the relationship between these three figures.
An unholy trinity, it sounds like.
Well, basically it would be a discussion of the whole delusional idea of a renovation of the church to make the church more accessible and appealing to the modern world, what I call the thin modernist approach to the faith, which insists that dogmas remain the same, the teaching is going to be affirmed, but we're going to present it in a new mode. There'll be a new mode of Catholicism which will somehow be more appealing and will in fact bring in a new age of Christendom, as Maritain in his delusional state imagined, only to be very bitterly disappointed afterwards.
So some of the speakers who have already addressed the conference have talked about, some of them grew up in the Novus Ordo and discovered tradition. Others, Father McMahon, I remember saying that he never actually attended the Novus Ordo because his parents had the grace to see what was going on and never left the traditional Mass. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience?
I remember when I was around 13 years old that something awful was in the process of unfolding in the church.
And what year would we be talking about? I have a distinct
memory of the felt banners appearing
in
my parish for the first time. This would have been in the early 60s, around 64, 65. Things were beginning to change. And then maybe this is an icon of the whole situation at that time. My nice old Catholic church in the Bronx, northeast Bronx where I grew up, St. Teresa's Church, burned down, as many churches did, coincidentally, at that time, to be replaced by a hideous modernist structure with a downward sloping floor leading to the new altar table. But at that time, my family had, on block, as it were, left the faith. We really weren't attending Mass any longer. I drifted away from the church for about 15 years. Until I realized it was time for me to get serious about life. I met my wife, the wife that God gifted me with, and we were married, and with the grace of matrimony, a lot of things changed, and I came back to the faith. My wife, by the way, was not a Catholic when we were married. We had to get a dispensation. And I did not make any strong efforts to convert her. I didn't try to pressure her into becoming a Catholic. But interestingly enough, when I came back to the church after marriage, we went immediately back to the traditional liturgy, which at that time was being held in independent chapels, in basements and hotels and so forth. And the attitude then was, so the Pope thinks he's banned the traditional Mass? Well, sorry, we'll just go to this hotel until you come to your senses.
And had Archbishop Lefebvre and the Society been established in this country yet?
Oh, well, in fact, what happened was my wife saw the Latin Mass at one of these independent chapels, and the mere sight of it converted her.
Wow.
My wife is not impeded by the problem of overweening pride. She's someone who sees the truth, and when she sees it, she accepts it. She saw the truth as revealed in the liturgy, where the substance of the faith appears most dramatically, and she said to herself, "That's serious religion. These people take their religion seriously."
Reminds me of the Russian emissaries who reported back to Prince Vladimir that they had seen the divine liturgy in Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, and they essentially said when we entered the church and they started their liturgy, we couldn't tell whether we were still on earth or in heaven.
That's very true, especially if you've heard the divine liturgy, you would know that. I heard it not too long ago in Moscow, as a matter of fact. But speaking of Archbishop Lefebvre, my wife converted, and she was confirmed in 1983 by Marcel Lefebvre, before the so-called schism of 1988. And the liturgy has the power to convert in and of itself, just the sight of it. And of course, the graces that come with it.
And then conversely, bad liturgy is very destructive for our faith. Would you agree?
Well, Klaus Gamber said it best. He said that if you had gone to sleep, if you were in a coma, and you had come back to the church and you looked for a Catholic church after an absence of some 30 or 40 years, and you wandered into the local Catholic church, you might think you had stumbled into some other Christian community. You wouldn't recognize it as the faith that you had left behind. And he asks in his work, Reform of the Liturgy, where is the faith of our fathers? The Roman right has been destroyed. Who will give us back what we've lost? He speaks of, to use the German word, Heimat, the home, the liturgical home, which was destroyed when the new calendar was introduced along with the new liturgy. It was as if someone had come into your house, taken out all the furniture, and replaced everything that you were familiar with folding chairs and card tables. The people became disoriented. This wasn't their home any longer. And the sense developed that if the church could do this with something as fundamental as her liturgy, if she no longer takes her own liturgy seriously, if she says, never mind about all that, the previous 2,000 years of Catholic worship, then maybe she's not serious about the other things as well. Well, and there was an erosion of the faith as a whole because of the destruction of the liturgy and the chaos that ensued.
And you mentioned the word disoriented, and of course I've heard you say many times, to quote Sister Lucia, the diabolical disorientation in the yet to be revealed part of the third secret that we haven't seen. So,
well, the disorientation consists of this idea that I mentioned a few moments ago, this idea of the thin modernist, or the modernist as reformer, as Pope St. Pius X called him. Someone who says, oh yes, dogmas are dogmas and the truth is the truth, but we're going to find a new way of stating things, we're going to renovate the church, we're going to make the world understand that the church is a wonderful thing. It's just a question of finding the correct mode of presentation, which we haven't had until now. Now that presumption itself is destructive of the faith, because if you're going to say to the world, you know, we've gotten it wrong for all these centuries, but now we're hip to the jive of the modern world, we're going to give you Catholicism like you've never seen it before, and now you'll really appreciate the faith. There's a couple of things involved here. First of all, there's this absurd presumption that you know better than all the saints that preceded you how to present the faith. And then secondly, there's the idea that this is a church that got it wrong for all those centuries. We didn't know how to talk to man. We didn't understand human needs. And if you look at the conciliar documents, and in particular Pope Paul's address at the close of the council, he basically says that, oh, now we understand the needs of contemporary man. We didn't really understand this before, but in our embrace of the world in this unique council, we now will attend to the needs of modern man in a way that we haven't seen before.
We have the cult of man, right?
Yeah, well, that's not an exact translation, but in essence, he says, we more than anyone appreciate the new humanism.
Right.
That's what he calls it, the new humanism.
And Pope Francis has taken that appreciation to unprecedented levels.
He's reduced it to a grotesque caricature, even of what Paul VI had in mind. I like to call the result the People's Republic of Bergoglio.
Yes.
Because we have here a pope, and his own spokesman said this, who thinks that he's free to do whatever he pleases, and he disposes of tradition whenever he likes.
Right.
And now, for the first time, the church is governed by an individual.
Right. The quote that I always remember, I forget who reported this, but he supposedly told Cardinal Mueller, who he dismissed, as prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, supposedly in a private meeting between those two after the Pope had demanded that he fire some of his best staff.
Right.
He told Cardinal Mueller, "I am the Pope. I do not have to give a reason for my decision."
No, he's an autocrat, and the Pope is not supposed to be an autocrat. And providentially enough, in one of his last addresses, or actually I think it was at the outset of his pontificate, yes it was the very first pontifical address he gave after being installed as Pope. He said that the Pope must not promote his own ideas. He has to remain faithful to the deposit of the faith. The Pope is not an absolute dictator whose will is law.
Yes.
And unfortunately, it seems that with this Pope, we have precisely that sort of Roman pontiff who thinks that his will is law, who clearly does not feel bound by the teaching of his predecessors.
And he's been appropriately dubbed by Henry Sire the dictator Pope.
Yeah, and that book is a bestseller for a reason, because more and more people are waking up to the reality that this Pope has taken the logic of Vatican II, this updating of the church, to its final extremity. He's going to update the church in ways that now attack even something as fundamental as the Sixth Commandment. Amoris Laetitia is a catastrophe in the realm of moral theology, particularly the infamous paragraph 303, which says that within the concrete complexity of one's limits, the continued participation of a couple in adulterous sexual relations may be the best that they can offer God at this point, what is for now the best that they can offer, and may be what God is expecting of them. as if it were impossible to fulfill
Right.
the sixth commandment with the grace of matrimony.
So speaking of Amoris Laetitia, before we wrap up our discussion, so there's been a very historic public act of resistance recently. Our good friend and colleague, editor-in-chief of Catholic Family News, Brian McCall, is a signatory to this new open letter to the bishops of the Catholic Church. It was made public earlier this week, April 30th, which I believe is the feast of St. Catherine of Siena, another famous corrector of the Pope, you might say, in her day. So the essence of this letter is that the signatories are accusing Pope Francis, after years of seeing his agenda unfold, they're accusing him of the canonical delict of heresy, and basically calling for action on the bishops to investigate this accusation, this claim, and then they list page after page after page of copiously documented evidence.
Well, there are 7 allegations fully supported by the Pope's own statements and the contrary statements of the ordinary and the extraordinary magisterium. The 7 allegations boil down to 2 allegations, essentially. The first allegation would be that this Pope has relativized exceptionless precepts of negative precepts of the natural law, particularly the 6th commandment, thou shalt not commit adultery, to which there are no exceptions under any circumstances whatsoever. God will never accept or tolerate willful deviations from a negative precept, one of the thou shalt nots. In this case, thou shalt not commit adultery in the form of a second so-called marriage. In Amoris Laetitia, we have a thematic discussion of this new idea that there can be a form in the Church of situation ethics, depending upon the complexity of one's limits, the concrete complexity. And the words concrete and complex appear throughout this document.
Yes.
One could be excused in the sight of God for violations of the natural law involving the negative precept against adultery. This is not only revolutionary, it's disastrous. To say that this doesn't constitute a heresy is to be pharisaical in one's interpretation of the term heresy. There's a column by Jimmy Aiken for Catholic Answers, a laughably superficial treatment of this whole problem. He doesn't even engage on the merits of the 7 particularized allegations. He simply says, well, heresy is, and he gives the strict canonical definition, the obstinate post-baptismal denial of a doctrine of divine and Catholic faith. And if you're talking about extraordinary papal definitions of dogmas, there are only 3 or 4 in the entire history of the Church. He excludes the entire ordinary magisterium. He excludes the 6th commandment. So according to him, the Pope could say the 6th commandment is optional and not be a heretic. So this is the kind of pettifoggery that people like Aiken have resorted to. And there's no analysis, no real serious discussion. One of the signatories of this letter is Aidan Nichols. Even the secular press recognizes that he is one of the world's foremost theologians. Right. This is a heavy hitter,
and yet
the heaviest of the heavy hitters.
Slandered as like second string, just hack job.
No, yeah, Aidan Nichols is a world-class theologian of the first rank. No one, not even the secular press, denies that. For him to sign on to a document containing these allegations indicates that we're in the midst of an unparalleled historical development.
And it's gaining signatories every day. I just checked, I think the latest tally is up to like 67. So, people are slowly but surely coming on board. So, in light of our unprecedented circumstances with the possibility of a formally heretical pope, where's the light at the end of the tunnel?
Well, let's not say he's formally heretical. Let's say he's uttered statements which have the objective character of heretical propositions. They're not saying in this letter, the Pope is a heretic and we denounce him as such.
Right.
All they're saying is, look at what he said. He said these things which clearly and flatly contradict teachings of both the universal and the universal ordinary magisterium and the extraordinary magisterium. These appear to be contrary to faith, i.e. heretical in the broader sense, not the strict and pharisaical sense that people like Aiken are using. And we would like the bishops to make inquiry of the Pope, to sound him out, as it were, and get him to retract these statements or clarify them in a way which would make them compatible with the faith. And I don't see how that's even possible, because there's a flat contradiction. That's all they're saying in this letter. They're saying to the bishops, do your job as descendants of the apostles, and do what the popes did during the reign of John the 22nd, back in the 1300s, when he denied the immediacy of the beatific vision. The bishops, many of them, and French theologians in particular, rose up as one against the Pope. There was a furor throughout the church because we had a Pope who was insisting in a series of sermons, and even in a treatise that he wrote, that the blessed departed will not see God until the end of time and the day of judgment, which has all kinds of implications for Catholic doctrine, including the doctrine on purgatory. He finally retracted his error because of the opposition of so many in the church. He retracted it on his deathbed, literally, a day or two before he died. And that's what these signatories are doing now with this letter. Only with Francis, we have an even more egregious example of a pope who insists on preaching his own thought as if it were the magisterium. In fact, he said something like that. He says, I'm constantly giving speeches and interviews. That's magisterium. That's what I think. That's a verbatim quotation of what he said in one of his airplane magisterium exercises.
I remember that.
So that's all they're doing in this letter. They're saying, there's a problem here. You need to confront him and get an answer to these questions that you're posing. They're not actually saying he's a formal heretic.
Right.
We denounce him as such. That's not the import of the letter.
Right. And I, for one, applaud them wholeheartedly. I'm very glad that they've done this. You know, even if it doesn't produce practical results, so to speak, because most likely the world's bishops, most of them are going to remain silent. But it's important for the historical record to show that, you know, if I hear you quote frequently, I think it was Cardinal Newman who talked about during the Arian crisis, the laity were more faithful to their baptismal vows than the episcopacy, something to that effect.
He makes an important distinction there. He says in that essay on consulting the faithful in matters of doctrine, which appeared in this magazine called The Rambler, he said it isn't that the bishops, the generality of bishops, didn't believe the true doctrine of the divinity of Christ. Most of them probably did internally. Only some of them were actually openly and willfully Arian heretics. The problem was that they remained silent. They went along with it. They went with the flow. Whereas the faithful, the generality of the faithful, went the other way. They defended, ironically enough, what the bishops themselves had taught them and what they had learned as the inheritance of the faith passed down for generation after generation from the hierarchy. It wasn't that the faithful gave the church the doctrine. No, the faithful preserved what the teaching church had handed down. And in this time of crisis, they kept to the faith more faithfully than the bishops who were either silent or actually heretical.
I think the irony of, before we wrap up here, the irony of our situation, you know, the Vatican II essentially ushered in what a lot of people refer to as the age of the laity. And yet the hierarchy is refusing to listen to the laity who are actually trying to uphold the faith. So that's what we're trying to do with this weekend at this conference, is to, you know, build one another up in our most holy faith, as it says in St. Jude's epistle. We hope that we're doing that for you if you're watching. Thank you so much for being with us, and stay tuned to our website. We're going to be releasing the conference videos shortly on our website so that everyone can have a chance to view those online. Thanks, Chris, for your time.
You're welcome.